Okay, so tonight we have Roger Lederer and he will be talking about winter survival.
Hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. This is a book I wrote 2 years ago, and I wrote it because I was thinking about all these other books I read about how happy birds are, how happy-go-lucky they are. Just, having eggs and migrating and singing and doing all this great stuff. And what people don't think about is they're only doing that a couple of months in the year. The rest of the year, you're just trying to survive. Actually, you're trying to survive while they're breeding as well. But they've got a tough life. It's a pretty darn tough life. And one of the toughest parts is the winter, which we're going to talk about. I didn't bring any books along to sell because, frankly, you can get them cheaper at Amazon. I don't get free books. People always think authors get free books. They don't get free. We maybe get 2 or 3, but that's about it. I can get a discount, but I can get them cheaper on Amazon. So anyway, that's where you're going to buy them. Speaking of books, we have another author here, Paul Bells. Raise your hand. Who just published a book, History of Bidwell Pond. Okay, so what this book is all about. It's about survival, but one chapter is about winter, or about weather, I should say. So I was interested in winter. I worked on Townsend solitaires. I spent several years up at the Eagle Lake Field Station near Susanville. And I was there summers, and I thought I'd go back one year in the winter because it's pretty nice up there in the wintertime. There's nobody up there. We've got the second biggest lake in California all to yourself, frozen over. It's a fascinating place. Then I discovered these guys, Townsend solitaires. Townsend solitaires were setting up territories all around that area, the field station and lots of other areas, I'm sure. They were only there in the winter, and they only ate juniper berries. I never saw them. I studied them for 5 years in January. So from January about 2nd to the 30th, I was up there at the field station trying to get my butt out of bed at 6:30 in the morning, and the snow and the wind and the rain. And these guys were up on the top of juniper trees, just eating junipers and setting up territories. And their only competition was robins, who did the same thing. You think of robins being birds of the spring. Well, these guys were also in the winter. And what happened when there was a lot of berries? When there were just an average amount of berries, and I go around and count the berries, not every berry in every tree, but on a little square, I count all the berries in a square and count a couple hundred trees, and figured out what the berry density was. When the berry density was sort of average berry density, they held territories. When there were lots and lots and lots of berries, they didn't hold territories. And when there are very few berries, they didn't hold territory. Because what's the point when you've got so many berries? It's plenty for everybody. You don't have to defend them when there's so few berries. It's waste your time defending it. So it's called facultative territoriality. So sometimes they're territorial, sometimes they're not. But they didn't eat anything but juniper berries as far as I could find out. Okay, the birds have a tough time depending on what bird it is, where they are, and whether they're migrating or not. But take a look at this one. Black-capped chickadees over the winter, their survival range is from 43 to 95%. This is a study done in Connecticut. And you can see the black-capped chickadees range over there. It's all in the north, so they're all in cold weather all the time. Older and more dominant birds survive longer, which is what you would expect. Now, this is interesting. You look here, this is a very broad generalization, but about half the birds, folks say there's about 9 billion birds in North America. About half of them are migratory birds. About 4 billion birds fly an average of about 860 miles from north to south during a migration. So they're only going 860 miles south. And 4.7 billion birds go about 2,000 miles, 1,960 miles. But what happens? The ones that go 860 miles only is a 35% mortality rate. But the ones that go farther, 1,960 miles, are only 23% mortality rate. So even though migration is tough on birds, a lot of birds die during migration, especially young ones, they spend a nice warm winter. While these guys around 860 miles are spending a little colder winter. So it's better to take a chance on migrating a little farther to get better weather. Now let's take a quick review here. Homeothermic and poikilothermic. Homeothermic means this applies to birds and mammals, and like us. We maintain our body temperature. So we're always 98.6. That's not quite accurate, but in general, that's what we use. 98.6 is being normal. And if something happens to cool us down, our body warms us up. Something happens to warm us up, the body cools us down. So we're homeothermic, same temperature. Poikilothermic means variable temperature, and that's lizards and insects and snakes and fish and so on. They're basically the temperature of their environment, which is why you see lizards sitting on top of a rock early in the morning, or butterflies in winter, warming themselves up so their metabolism can get going so they can survive. There are cases of people being poikilothermic, especially people who've been in accidents, because the brain stem back here, the back of your head, the base of your skull, controls temperature. And if you're injured there, you may not be able to control temperature, which means you always have to be in a decent environment, 80, 90 degrees all the time. You can't go outside where it's really cold or really hot. Remember Ed McLaughlin, our friend Ed McLaughlin was in a bicycle accident. He had that problem. He had to be cooled off or warmed up. Okay, so we have comfortable temperatures. I mean, when you start feeling cold, when you start feeling warm. So this is called the thermoneutral zone. So we're in the thermoneutral zone where we are right here. We're not expending energy to cool ourselves down, we're expending energy to warm ourselves up. But once it gets too hot, maybe 85, 90 degrees, we start sweating, we start panting, we start breathing harder, and so on. And then when lower temperature, same thing. We start, shivering, we start doing all kinds of stuff to keep ourselves warm. So, and notice that the upper critical temperature goes up a lot faster than the lower critical temperature. And especially true for birds. Birds will die very quickly in the heat. They'll last a lot longer in the cold. And when you heard about chickens who get avian flu or something like that, and some farm has 10,000 chickens, the way they kill them, they eat them up. Rather than gassing them or choking them or anything, they just heat them up and they die very quickly. There we go. Every animal has its thermoneutral zone, and they're going to be different depending on the birds. Here we have a hummingbird from South America. Thermoneutral zone is 55 to 82 degrees centigrade. And the Gamble quail is 86 to 111, and the ostriches from 50 to 122. And penguins, of course, cooler, 14 to 68. So songbirds, little guys like this yellow-headed blackbirds, can live 1 to 3 days without food, but it depends on how cold it is, how much they've eaten before, and so on. Well, one example here, long-tailed tits, these are in Europe, need to increase their body weight by 10% so they can last overnight. So imagine that, could you put on 10% of your weight every night? If you could burn it off in the morning, it would be nice. Not going to work that way. Well, birds are reacting to this cold now because it's their body temperature is going to stay the same, so they've got to be burning up all kinds of energy. If they don't have enough energy to survive, they're not going to be singing, they're not going to be doing other kinds of things. So I forgot to mention one thing, just one quick little story. I'm not going to tell you the whole thing because it's too long. But I was in Alaska a couple of years ago and on a fishing trip, and we were out in the middle of nowhere, and it was very cold. It was raining, it was windy, and we didn't have all our gear, and we had a tent. And I was really cold, and I crawled in my sleeping bag in the tent. And about 5 minutes later, it was like burning up. It was like somebody was throwing hot water on. I was scalding. I was painful. And I couldn't figure out why it's human. That sleeping bag off, started taking my clothes off. I was going to crawl outside, and I thought, that's pretty dumb. It's really cold out there. what had happened to me was that when you get really cold, it's hypothermia, when you get really cold for a long time, all your blood goes from your arms and your legs to your thorax, to your stomach, to your brain, keep you warm. And that's what happened to me. I had lost a lot of blood. When I got back, my feet could go, I got warmed up a little bit, all the blood went back out again, and it stimulated all the painful nerve ending. So it's not fun, but you can see how people start that once you get hypothermic, you can really get stupid because your brain is not getting enough oxygen. Doesn't happen to birds though, because they have very little flesh in their legs or their wings, so they're not losing anything out in their extremities. So here's a nightingale, and they sing during the night, and it's related to how much they sing is related to their body mass. And European robins sing more when they greet the dawn. They greet the dawn with a higher body mass than a lower one. So if they put on a lot of weight and they have enough energy in the morning because of that weight, they sing. And they did this experimentally. They took chickadees and put them in cages, and they'd sing. They know exactly how much the bird weighed, how much they ate, and if they fed them supplementary food, they sang more at dawn. So birds are simply more active, sing more if they have more food in their belly. Now, they're getting food out there, but the other thing about most birds is they have to avoid being food, which is this guy shows a little blue tip. I like some, I know you guys see American birds all the time, but I thought I'd throw some European ones in. So birds want to put on fat, so they'll eat fatty food. You know, a lot of seeds are fatty food, sunflower seeds and so on. There's a lot of oil in there, so they want to eat those kinds of things to get themselves their extra body mass before they try to survive a winter night. But if they're eating a lot, what happens? Two things. One, they're out there more eating around and they're exposing themselves to predators, right? Two, they're fatter and they don't fly quite as fast. So if you put on 10% weight, you're going to be a little bit slower. So they face a trade-off. So birds now have to eat as much as they can, but not too much. So how much is that? Well, every day is different because of the variation in temperature, wind, and all sorts of other stuff. But here's a little graph here. These are just probabilities, but look at this one, the one with the black dots. This is the most likely one. So here, the body mass, if the body mass is low, the probability of death is high. The body mass is high, the probability of death is still fairly high. So if your body mass, assuming this is your average mass of your small bird, right about here, right in the middle, 16 grams. You're 10 grams, you're going to die. You're 22 grams, you're probably going to die. If you're 16 grams, you're probably going to live. So you just want to eat enough to get you through the night so you can sing in the morning and not eat so much that you're going to be fat and give somebody else a meal. And this is how we measure fat. So you get a bird like this European goldfinch, you blow on their chest, and this is the fat. And it's right there in the furcula, you know, the furcula, the wishbone is right here. And you can see this in birds, you blow on them and you can blow the feathers away, and you can see the fat right here. And below that is, of course, the sternum. And there are ways to measure if you want to do this. Some people who are banding birds and they look at the fat content. There's 8 different level scores of how you measure this fat. If the bird is really skinny, and I showed my wife this a couple of years ago, and our neighbor gave us an immature red-shouldered hawk that had just fledged. It was sitting at his fence. So we took it home, and not only not had no fat, but in the sternum, you could feel the sternum, it was almost sharp, but it was just no meat right here. The thing was starving to death. So we force fed him for, I don't know, a week or so. and then he magically escaped. It's a whole different, we have it in a big box like this, cover the box, put a blanket over it, or a big towel over it. And every couple hours we go out and feed him. We went out there, he was gone. The top was still on, the blanket was still on, and towel was still on, but he was gone. But you could hear him. And he's still around, we think. Anyway, this is what fills up first. And the sternum, if he's got no muscle on there, the sternum will fill up, and then the fat will fill up. And of course, birds that are migrating are going to have as much fat as possible. The ptarmigan puts on extra fat, comprising 32% of its winter body mass, almost doubles its weight, and puts on more plumage for the winter. Every time I see ptarmigan, it reminds me of the story of this town in Alaska called Chicken, Alaska. It's up north. And people moved in there during the gold rush, and they wanted to name the town. They're going to name it after these birds, but nobody could spell ptarmigan, so they called it Chicken. So it's now Chicken, Alaska. The Eskimo curlew, which probably doesn't exist anymore, went on the endangered species list in 1966. One of the first birds to go on the endangered species list when the Endangered Species Act came into being. But Eskimo curlews used to come down from the Arctic and they go through the mid-Idaho, Wyoming, Rocky Mountain states and fly down to South America for the winter. They would put on so much fat, incredible amounts of fat, that when hunters hunted them, they would fall down and bounce on the ground and was flat, and they looked like dough. They had so much fat on it, just a big pile. They called them dough birds. And birds were hunted at that time in the late 1800s and early 1900s for the bird markets of back east. They would ship birds by train to New York and Boston and so on. And these were one of the big birds that they hunted for 11 months of the year. They were allowed to hunt these birds. Now there are no more. But they call them dough birds just because of that. It wasn't dough, it was fat. There was so much fat on them for their migratory trip. Okay, so what happens now? We're not going to worry about supercritical temperature. We're talking about winter now. So what happens when the bird gets exposed to this lower critical temperature and starts to get cold? I worked, when I was going to graduate school, the professor I was working with in ornithology did stuff on climate and energy in birds. And a lot of his graduate students would put birds in cold environments and freeze them to death. Basically what happened to most of them, but also measure their physiology as they deteriorated, which is not fun, but hopefully they don't do that anymore. So you've always seen Christmas cards this time of year, right? And the birds are always fluffed up. And they're fluffed up because fluffing increases insulation value about 50 to 30%. You're simply pulling the feathers up, putting air spaces between the feathers, and so the body heat has a harder time getting off the body. But what if it rains instead? Which they fluff up the feathers, the rain's going to hit their body and cool themselves off. So instead of, when it's raining, they slick their feathers down like this. They don't fluff themselves up. Or they increase the number of feathers, 25% increase for the common eider. In the eider, they still collect down from eider for, various kinds of products, but they collect it down from the nests. So the birds pull it down out of their bodies, line the nest with it. After the nesting is over, and this is in Iceland, then they go to the nest and take all the down out. So it's all very labor intensive. This is what the nest looks like. So if you want to buy a Icelandic eiderdown comforter, it's only $46.99 on sale here during this now. And that's because the whole eiderdown, or the amount of eiderdown they collect in Iceland now fills one truck. That's it. So save your money. And robins increase the number of feathers also, in this case, by 50%. But bullfinches, these are English again, or European, they don't add any extra feathers for the cold weather. Instead, they simply eat more. They look fat, but that's from the fat, not from extra feathering. Okay, what about this guy? He looks a little bedraggled. He's standing on ice. Imagine how long he will stand on ice. We couldn't do it very well, but they can stand on ice. And they may pull the other leg. In some cases, like flamingos, they'll pull the other leg up into their feathers, or shorebirds and so on. The joke always used to be, why do birds stand on one leg? Because if they lift it up, they'd fall down. But the real reason is you're simply trying not to lose any body heat off that leg. But the way that works is they can stand in the water. Ducks will have, well, all birds have this called a counter current exchange. So what happens here? Warm blood from the body's core travels down the leg, as it normally does. And then here's the venous blood coming back. So the heat from the blood from the body coming down into the leg is actually shunted over to this cold venous blood coming back. And so you don't get falling, you get cooler blood coming down here and warmer blood going back to the heart. So even though you get some circulation in your legs, most of it, you're not getting all this cold blood back into your thorax and your abdomen. And birds have so little blood in their legs anyway, they're really not freezing to death. So this is a good mechanism to keep themselves warm, even though they're standing in cold water. And you can see a more realistic picture here is a duck foot with the artery and vein, but they're all intermingled like this. It's not just one artery, one vein coming down, they're intermingled so we can get that counter current circulation, it's called. In penguins, they also have a counter current circulation. They're standing on ice, of course, most of the time. But they also have it in their nasopharyngeal passages, that is in their throat. In their throat, in the back of their mouth, they do the same thing. They're exchanging, pulling a lot of cold air in, and they're exchanging that blood there so that the cool, warm blood goes down back into the heart, and the cool blood goes up this way. And they get, so they're, some of the heat from the expiring air is recaptured as high as 80%. So they're taking in the cold air, not throwing out hot air, and capturing all that hot air. The chicks, who have very little insulation when they're first hatched, are brooded by the parents till they're 25 days old. And their downy coat develops. After that, it works fine in calm winds, but it's even more efficient in high winds because it pushes down the feathers, flattens the feathers out, and so the young can withstand really cold temperatures. Now, this is what a typical bird looks like. These are feather tracks. If you ever pluck a bird, open it up, chicken, pigeon, anything like that, you'll see that there are pterali. These are called pterali, the feather tracks, up and down. And then there are apterali, which are places where there's no feathers attached. It's just that the feathers from the wings over and the body overlap these naked areas. And when a bird, for instance, sits on eggs, they have a brood patch, but with apterally, there's no feathers actually attached here. They simply spread these other feathers apart and sit on the eggs. In the case of penguins, they have no apterally. Everything is covered by feathers. You can see how thick this is. So when that flattens out, you still have lots of air spaces. It's very good insulation. I don't know if you can get penguin coats or anything. This is a personal view of how cold it was out there. So this was the summertime. Also, birds huddle together like this. They'll huddle together in a nest box somewhere, or like this on a branch, or just in the snow like this. And the penguins have these groupings. There'll be thousands of birds together, and they keep moving around. So there's constantly circulation. So birds are going in, they're going in the middle, they're coming back out. So no one bird sits out here all the time. They're constantly moving, keeping each other warm. And it actually gets to be in the middle of this mass here to be 70 degrees above zero, 70 degrees, a very nice comfortable temperature in the winter. So if you ever get stuck in Antarctica and get in the middle of a bunch of penguins. And birds benefit by roosting, of course. They're all roosting together, sometimes in thousands, in barns or places like that. You remember that episode 5, 6, 7 years ago in Beebe, Arkansas. B-E-E-E-E-E. This is not the only place it happened, I'm sure, but it hit the news. In Beebe, Arkansas, somebody set off all kinds of fireworks on Christmas or on New Year's Eve, right near where these birds were roosting. And birds came flying out of these barns and whatever structures there were thousands of them dead the next morning, all over the place. They're running to each other, the buildings, they're raining to be placed up. Because they were all huddled together to stay warm. Once they got scared, flew out. Now they have these collisions, but then they froze. And apparently there were a bunch of other situations like that too, but that was the one that made the news. Also, birds, when they're cold like that, can simply squat on their feet. Because their feet aren't losing that much heat, but they do lose a little bit of it. So they can, like the penguins, also squat on their feet. Or they tuck their bills in. So they're not losing as much body heat, and they're not losing any heat off the bills as well. And see, you're standing on one leg. Actually done some studies a couple of years ago. They found out that toucans' bills were radiating heat to keep themselves cool. So some people did studies, well, what are bills actually being used as radiators? And they are. So birds with bigger bills spend more time tucking in their feathers. So the bigger the bill you have, the more time it's sticking in your feathers to keep yourself warm. And if you're a grebe, you can bend your legs over, put your feet down absolute on your back. So it's sticking up in the air, but he'll fold it over. And rough grouse will actually fly and then dive into the snow and make themselves a little cave for the evening. And then in the morning, they'll pop out of the cave, they'll defecate in the cave and then take off. And hopefully they don't hit the same cave when they dive the next night. Now, this is an interesting exception. This is the great cormorant. Great cormorants live 365 days a year on the edge of Greenland, right here. Very cold. In the winter, 24 hours a day of darkness. Let's see, spend 2% of their daily activities fishing and 3% farming. So 2% of their daily activities fishing. They get enough energy from fishing in that 2% of their day. It lasts them overnight. They can't dry themselves out. They stand outside, and like cormorants do. They stand outside and put their wings up like that. It's 40 below, and the wind is blowing 40 miles an hour. They can't do that. They just eat enough to keep themselves warm to the entire season. I think that's pretty amazing. And then shivering. Birds don't shiver as much as we do. They do a little bit of it, but not very much. It's usually the last strategy, usually when everything else is going. Same thing with us, pretty much. If we can't raise our temperature by running around or something, heating ourselves up with heating blankets, we start to shiver. But birds don't do it quite as much. Now, what are some of the effects of this? So we've known this for a while. We just take one example here. The body sizes, you measure the body sizes of downy woodpeckers down here in Florida and measure them every couple of 100 miles as you go farther north. We found there's a 10% increase in body size from Florida to north. I'm sure it's the same thing from Arizona to British Columbia. And here's the length, so 5.5 inches to 6.7 inches, and the weight is going up, and the wingspan going up, and so on. And there's lots of examples like this in the bird world and in the mammal world. It's called Bergmann's rule. Let me show you what this is. If you look at a cube like this, the size of 1 centimeter inside, the surface area, the area of the side is 1 centimeter, then the area of the cube surface is 6 times 1 centimeter. So the volume is 1 cubic centimeters. So the ratio should be ratio, not ration. Ratio of surface area, like this, to the volume on the inside is 6 to 1. So the surface area is basically 6 times as large as the volume. But as we get bigger, double that and double that again and so on, we get up to here like 4 centimeters, 4 times the linear size. We end up with this ratio of surface area, 3 to 2, or 1.5 times. What does that mean? When you're small, if you're a hummingbird or you're a shrew or a little mouse, you're losing a lot of heat off your body. And what's producing that heat is inside, right? We have cavities on the inside. But you get so much surface area, you're losing all that heat. You get a little bit bigger, your inside get a little bit bigger compared to your surface area, so you're not losing quite as much heat if you're a squirrel. And if you're a horse, again, you're not losing as much heat as you're producing. And then you get to the point you're an elephant. What happens with elephants? Now we've got they're so big that they're producing more heat than they get rid of, so they have big ears. So the small birds have a tougher time than bigger birds. Small animals have a tougher time than bigger animals. So we go back to this. What's happening here? So you want to be bigger if you're farther north. That's the whole point. So you're smaller down here, you don't have to worry about getting all that, to getting cold. And when you get up, you lose heat, but it's warm down here. But up here, you're losing heat and you're at a disadvantage. So you get a bigger body. So you get bigger body woodpeckers of the same species up north than you do down south. And that happens with 70% of birds and probably most mammals as well. Bergmann's rule, that's called. But if we look now, so bigger bodies in cooler areas is what we're talking about, right? So what happens here? If we measure birds in a museum, all these lines are different species of birds. Measure birds in a museum since they were collected in the 1880s to about today. Body sizes decrease. So body sizes of birds are decreasing overall. Why? Because you've got global warming for 100 years. So this is where you can see it's actually happening. So very small, but it's a consistent pattern all across the bird world. Now, the other rule, there's actually 3 rules, but only 2 of them apply here. The other rule is Allen's rule. Allen's rule says that, a study of 43 species of terns and gulls on unfeathered legs or shorter and colder environments. Allen's rule says that In colder environments, your appendages ought to be shorter because you're going to lose less body heat that way. And so it's true with birds. You measure their legs, you measure their wings, they're going to be shorter in colder environments. Can you think of any humans that applies to? Eskimos. You think about Eskimos, what they call Inuits, I'm not quite sure the proper term, but they're shorter legs and shorter arms because they've evolved in that environment. And so we also find this. We know that toucans, we learned that recently, that toucans are, they have bills that are actually radiated. That's why toucans have big bills. In warm environments, they can radiate and let go of excess heat like that. So if we look at other groups of birds, this is the toucans. These are barbets. Those are barbets. These are parrots. These are finches. These are chickens. These are penguins, gulls, and terns. We measure all those things. We can see the geographical variation. So the bills get smaller as you go farther north. They get bigger as you go farther south. Again, an example of Allen's rule. Appendages get shorter in colder environments. And then birds also cope by doing things like going into torpor. This is a four-wheel. So below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, they'll go into torpor. They'll lower their body temperatures 10, 15, 20 degrees for up to 10 to 20 days, not eating at all, just sitting there like this. Now, hummingbirds do the same thing. Normal body temperature hummingbirds, 100 to 104, show that their body temperature will drop, but not below 64, 68 degrees. And then the Canada jay used to be called a gray jay. They changed it. Apparently there was a big to do about Canada jay. Like, what was the other bird they were thinking of? When the Canadians voted on something, they voted a different bird besides the Canada jay. It was either the loon or bald eagle or something. But the Canadian government picked the Canada jay anyway, and people got upset. So anyway, the Canada jay also could enter the state of hypothermia with its body temperature drop down to about 99 degrees Fahrenheit. And I think one of the most amazing ones here is this Clark's nutcracker. Clark's nutcrackers we find, in the Rocky Mountains. And they collect pine seeds all year round, starting in July, collect pine seeds, put them in their throat pouches, and then they cache these pine seeds in lots and lots of places, hundreds of places, in little caches. And they can find these caches. There's been experiments done with these guys, with the European nutcracker, and they can find these things even after snow. They need 2 feet of snow. When they buried it before there was snow, they can still find 90% of it. So they're pretty amazing that way. So they bury all these caches, then once the snows, and they start breeding, they start nesting and laying eggs in January in Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, places like that. And they'll brood and they'll raise the eggs. And the male has a brood pouch as well as a female, so they trade off and keep the eggs warm. And they'll go around, one of them will go pick up the nuts from the caches, and the other one will be taking care of the young back and forth. So it's like February when they're having young in pretty miserable weather. Okay, so that's some views of how birds can make it through the winter.